This lecture will discuss thyroid hormone and its effects. So the thyroid gland is situated in the neck and it has two lobes that straddle the trachea. It's mainly comprised of thyroid follicular cells, but there is a second population of cells in here, the parathyroid cells, that are involved in calcium homeostasis. Thyroid follicular cells, though, have this kind of structure. This cartoon shows the epithelial cells surrounding a central lumen that has thyroglobulin stored in it with thyroid hormone attached to it. And the stimulation of the thyroid gland can result in enlargement to these follicular cells, and they can also reduce if the colloid is being reabsorbed. This is a histology slide stained to show you what they actually look like, and you see they're very similar. You have these epithelial cells on the outside and the colloid in the lumen that is comprised of thyroglobulin with thyroid hormone attached to it. So thyroid hormone comes in essentially two forms: T3, which is the active compound, and T4, which is thought of as the precursor. And T3 is generally 4 times more effective than T4. They're secreted from the thyroid gland follicular cells, as we just showed, and they're amine hormones, although they're not water soluble. And so they're transported in the blood, being bound to thyroid binding globulin or transthyretin, and then there's a small amount of that's free in solution. It's important to note that this free thyroid hormone is what is necessary for its function, because that is what will eventually go into its effector sites and cause its function. The release of thyroid hormone is stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone released from the anterior pituitary, and it enters cells via an energy dependent process and then goes into the nucleus, where it alters gene transcription, and this increases enzyme levels, which can affect growth, controls your basal metabolic rate, and it interacts and reinforces the activity of sympathetic stimulation. So in the lumen of these follicular cells, you have thyroglobulin, and it's here that T3 and T4 is created. So the thyroglobulin is then acted on by iodination, and it creates monoiodotyrosine and diiodotyrosine, and then these are conjugated by the same enzyme to create T4, which, as I said earlier, is the precursor form, and then T3, which is the active form. Obviously, iodine is required for biological activity. And so T4 is converted into T3 at the target sites, because T4 is generally the molecule that is transported in highest concentrations. And then the reverse T3 has no biological activity, and under some circumstances the body will turn T3 into reverse T3 to shut down its function. So there's a fairly intricate synthetic process to creating thyroid hormone, and this graph, this figure, describes it in some detail. And so we have many steps. You have the thyroid cell and with the basal membrane facing the blood, and then the apical membrane which faces the follicular lumen. And it all begins with this sodium iodine symport, this iodine trap, that can concentrate the iodine in the cytosol of these cells 30 times more than it is in the blood. So it has very high affinity, and it uses a sodium gradient to facilitate its transport across the membrane. And then it's transported through the cytoplasm and into the follicular lumen using a transporter called pendrin that passes iodine across the apical membrane into the follicular lumen. At the same time, amino acids go into the endoplasmic reticulum to create thyroglobulin, which is comprised of a lot of tyrosine molecules end on end with some other amino acids involved, and then this is packaged in the Golgi and then transported into the lumen of the follicle. Once in the lumen, then you have the reactions that we showed before. The iodine then binds with the thyroglobulin to form MIT and DIT, and then these are then conjugated to create T3 and T4. It's important to note that T4 is made in a much larger quantity than T3 in this situation. And then when it comes to release the product, when it comes to release thyroid hormone, you get this endocytosis that is then brought in through megalin into these colloidal droplets that have a small amount of thyroglobulin with MIT, DIT, thyroid hormone bound. This is then transported across the cytosol, and then proteases cleave T3 and T4 ready for release. And all the other iodinated compounds are then deiodinated, and the iodine is passed back into the follicular lumen to ensure maintenance of a good supply of iodine. Important to note that these are not released in equal amounts. T4 is passed out at greater concentrations than T3. So the control of thyroid hormone production is shown in this slide, and the thermal and caloric signals to the hypothalamus will stimulate thyrotropin releasing hormone that then passes down to the pituitary, and you get thyroid stimulating hormone released into the blood that then stimulates the thyroid gland. And the production of thyroid hormone will then feed back to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus to inhibit the release of both TRH and TSH. Note that there is no short loop feedback, so TSH doesn't actually feed back to the hypothalamus. It is the end products, the thyroid hormones, that do the main inhibitory feedback functions. So again, emphasizing that it's just long loop feedback. So TSH has tropic effects on thyroid cells. It binds to extracellular receptors on the thyroid gland, increases adenyl cyclase activity, increasing cyclic AMP, and this leads to a rise in intracellular calcium, phosphoinositol, and other growth factors. And you get increased DNA, RNA, protein, and phospholipids, which then increases the growth, increases the cell size, increases the cell number, and increases follicular formation. And at the same time, you get improvements to the synthesis of the hormone by trapping extra iodine, and then glucose oxidation and NADPH generation to facilitate the production of thyroid hormone. Once thyroid hormone is released, it's passed through the blood, and then it generally goes into its effector cells by active means, and then is changed from T4 into T3, and then T3 alters transcription in virtually all cells, and it increases the rate and the amount of many enzymes that increase growth and increase the respiratory output of these cells. So you get an increase in the sodium potassium ATPase, increase in mitochondria and the enzymes, and this leads to overall increases in oxygen consumption and an increase in metabolic rate as a result. And these confer then to whole body effects that increase your cardiac output, increase ventilation, will stimulate food intake, will stimulate heat production and sweating, etc. So it really sort of turns up your entire metabolic profile. One specific function that it has is to generate heat through brown adipocytes, and this effect is in synergy with norepinephrine. And this slide shows what actually happens. So you get cold, and then the hypothalamus will release TRH and TSH, and you get thyroid hormone released that will then go into the brown fat cells, and then you get sympathetic stimulation through norepinephrine, and that will then activate adenyl cyclase, and these two things then go into the nucleus and activate the transcription of uncoupling protein 1. And what uncoupling protein 1 does is it migrates into the mitochondria and uncouples the electron transport chain from the production of ATP. And so rather than get ATP formed, you get an increase in thermogenesis, the cell heats up, and this allows your body then to maintain thermoregulation. This slide shows you what happens with hypersecretion or hyposecretion of thyroid hormone. With hypersecretion, you have an enhanced excitability of the central nervous system. You sweat and feel uncomfortable in hot positions. Your weight loss is increased because you're just more metabolically active, result in diarrhea and muscle weakness, fatigue, but you can't sleep when your body shakes because of the enhanced respiratory function. Hyposecretion then is opposite, fatigue and extreme sleepiness, slow muscle responses, and you can see this in deep vein tendon reflexes, or deep tendon reflexes. Sorry, when you tap the knee and you get a reflex thing, these will relax slower due to a decrease in uptake in calcium. You get decreased cardiac output, weight gain, mental sluggishness, and constipation. So one aspect of thyroid hormone that comes about due to poor uptake of iodine or a deficiency in the iodine of the diet is that you get goiters formed in the neck. And I just want to explain why that happens. So TSH binds to the thyroid gland, and it's tropic to it. It increases the size and cell number. And obviously, if you don't have enough iodine, then you're not able to secrete enough thyroid hormone to inhibit the release of TSH and TRH from the pituitary and the hypothalamus respectively. And so without enough iodine, you don't get thyroid hormone, but you still get the signals from TSH. And because it's tropic, it causes these follicular cells to grow and become full of thyroglobulin, but not thyroid hormone. And so you get the constant secretion of tropic factors to the thyroid gland, and it becomes enlarged, causing these goiters. And this is a result of hypothyroidism, and it can mean too little effect of T3 and T4 because you're not making enough of it, or you don't have enough TSH, or you have too little TRH. Too much dopamine can also cause hypothyroidism by inhibiting the release of TRH or TSH, or you could have too few T3 or T4 receptors on peripheral cells. And these will all lead to symptoms of hypothyroidism.